So let's take a look at how web works, the HTTP protocol that makes all those websites function. What exactly is it? How do you set up and configure an HTTP server? HTTP servers come in all different ways, and how you configure them is going to depend on the individual server, but we're going to talk about certain settings you're going to want to look for when you get into it. Certain ones are more specific. They can be pretty easy to set up if you are working with the main one, the main default one for your operating system. If you're working with Microsoft, and you're trying to put in Internet Information Systems, it's an extension. I don't remember exactly how they call it, but it's like an add-on program with the operating system. You just have to select the option and it will install itself. It's one of the easiest programs to install on Windows. Now, to install Microsoft Internet Information Systems onto Linux, good luck with that. On the other hand, if you want to work with a server on Linux, the main one is going to be Apache Web Server. To get that in, it's just an option in your store. You just go into your software store and say, yes, I want my web server, give me Apache, and it will just about set the thing up for you. Getting it on Windows, there you got to go find it and download it and do all that other stuff. But there are many different types. There's not just those two. Those are the two mainline ones. There's a whole pile of web servers that you can get, that you can download. You can even code them yourself, but they can be quite complex. Just depends on what features you want in there. If you're just after a really basic one, there are some very lightweight servers, but if you really want to get deep, then I'd really recommend downloading a good one if you really want a good solid web server. And Apache has been pretty solid, and it's used in a lot of commercial environments too, as I've been seeing. To be a webmaster, you really need to understand this stuff, so let's dive on in and see what all's involved with our web protocol, HTTP, and web servers. Now, your clients can be browsers or bots. A browser is where you actually take your web browser and try and visit a website, whether that be on your phone or whether that be on your laptop, on your desktop, whatever computer you have. You're on that computer, you're trying to browse it, it's trying to show you the content. That's browsing. Bots, it's trying to read the source code. It's going to read that page, and some sites are better designed for bots to be able to read that, but they're going to try and read it and parse it and make some sense of it like a search engine will do. It's going to go in and it's going to try and grab that. If you're ever working with Ajax, that's also the bot type concept. You're going to write a special response from that server that bot's meant to work with. It's meant to read, it's meant to parse it easily, and then your page can respond to that. So whether or not it's being parsed by something that's supposed to make decisions on it that way, or whether it's being displayed, those are two options for clients. Now, servers are tasked with just pretty much, it's a pretty simple task, but it can be pretty complicated too. They're tasked with returning information upon a request. So they get a request from these clients, and then they return the response. But how they return this gets very complex, and it could be very important to your functionality and your security of your website and your web server. So let's take a look on into some of this stuff here. Website selection is one of the things that they're going to do. A web server is going to have oftentimes thousands of websites on them if it's a good commercial server. If it's just your own local home server, sometimes one. A lot of times you'll just deal with one default website. One of the things to understand with the selection process is a web server is going to listen on many different interfaces. An interface is going to be which IP stem is it going for, And over here on the examples on the side here, I have that example of IP stems. You have a loopback IP address like 127.0.0.1. It can also be called by the name localhost. But this is all, if it's listening on one, it's listening to both as far as the TCP is concerned. And that's what it's looking at here, is it's looking for the Transmission Control Protocol TCP socket. So in our case, if we're listening on that, we would have port 80, 127.0.0.1, port 80. That's one interface. Localhost is going to call that exact same interface. Now, if I'm listening on additional ports, maybe if I've got security or something like that in there, an SSL certificate, or I'm just using multiple ports, then I have those additional interfaces. It's only the listening points. If I'm also listening to, let's say it's my LAN connection that I have that's assigned to me by my router. Let's say that's 192.168.0.2. Let's say that's what my router gave my computer that I'm using to serve my website. That would be an additional listening point, an additional interface. And any other ports on that would be additional interfaces. If it's beyond port 80, if I add port 443 or any of the others, or just add other ports, add port 80, 88, or whatever I choose to, those would add additional interfaces. But calling my computer by its computer name, by its host name, that's going to be calling the same interface. And if I do have a domain name pointed at it, it's going to be whichever IP I've actually got that pointed at. So if I'm pointing it at my LAN IP address, it's going to be that same interface. So the default website catches anything that is not otherwise handled by another website on that server. The interfaces, an interface default means if it comes in on a particular interface, it overrides the default website for that interface. And if it's read on that interface but it's not captured by a named website, then it's handled by the interface default. Then we're going to look at named websites. Whenever that website is looked at, it will be looked at with the host name of whatever it was called as. So the host name is going to be different if you call the 127.0.0.1 as opposed to localhost. The host names are going to be different. And the port number is also something you can use to make that decision for the named website as well. But it can be looking and seeing, do I already have a website that captures that host name? So let's just say that we have 3 websites on our computer. We have a default website. We have an interface default that is for the 127.0.0.1. And then we have a named website for the local host. So if I call in anything over on, if I call in that 127.0.0.1, I'm not hitting that named website because that named website was only for the local host. Unless I also created one with that name. You could create one with a name for the IP. But in our case, we've only got the named website for the local host. So I missed my named website, but I have one that's for the interface, so that's the one that would be loaded on that. If I go to the local host, I've hit a named website, so it doesn't need to go anywhere further. But any of these other ones down, they're on a different interface that it's going to miss. They don't have a named website for it. It's not, the interface site isn't listening to that, so it's going to have to go to the default website. Now, what happens if I choose not to have a default website? it simply can't really be handled. It just says, hey, this is not available. It won't handle that request. So website selection is one of the things here that we're going to be looking at on the functionality. It's going to take a look at that. It's also the first gateway in security and access control. If there are files that you don't want published, the server deciding not to serve those documents is the first line of defense. The operating system can also provide additional layers of security for that as well. But ideally, if you've got a well-designed configuration, your server should block any of those requests before they ever get to the operating system. Then your operating system should be locked down so badly that it does not, that no matter what requests that, if it's not authorized, it would be denied there. That way you got two solid lines of defense. But servers also deal with default documents as well. Yes, there's default websites, but within a directory, if you have multiple files, what is the default document behavior? Let's just take a quick look here at a sample site. In this case here, I have a sample website set up where I've got two files on here, and this is the files on here. And in this case, I do not have an index. Now, I can choose to call my index HTML or whatever my default document is by whatever name I want to. I just need to make sure that my server has a list of files that it's going to look through in order as far as which ones it's going to really be hoping to find. And if it finds those, if I am going to call one of these guys directly, then of course I'm going to actually get the page. You know? So I've actually got a page on here. But if I did hit like directory and then it's going to look for default documents at that point. It can also handle error behavior as well. You can change over how it handles errors, such as a document that does not exist, can't find it. How does it handle this stuff? But in this case, I'm calling a directory, the home directory, but there's nothing in here. So a lot of times I'll have index.html or something like that will handle that. But how this is handled is a list of whatever I want to use. Do I want to look for a test HTML? I could reconfigure this and have it to where that page would be displayed instead of this directory listing. And what does it do? What's its behavior whenever it does not find a document? Does it display the directory? Or does it display an error? Or does it display something else entirely, which is usually handled by the error handling? If you wanted to have it handle an entirely different document than whatever's in here, you generally just set that up to be the error page that it would display. So default documents is one of the things that it does. It also handles content type identification. Now, if you're familiar with Windows versus Linux, on Windows, it identifies what type of file you have based on the extension. Are you dealing with a .txt, or is it a .bmp? How does it identify that? That's done by the file extension. Linux, it actually looks at the actual content. But with web, it looks at something entirely different. The server sends a content-type header as a part of the response. That content type identification is a MIME type. What follows that, the name is content-type and the value is whatever type that is. It's going to have the basic type / the detailed type, such as the txt file should be displayed as text / plain, and the BMP file is probably image / BMP or bitmap, maybe Windows -bitmap. I don't remember what they call it on BMP. But if it was a JPEG, then it would be image/JPEG. That's important to identify that, so that way when the client gets that, it knows how to work with that. Which handler is the browser going to use to look at this document? Are we dealing with an HTML file? Are we dealing with an XML file? How do I display this? The server tells it. But we can also adjust how it's telling it. If we have different things, we can say, hey, this extension, so even though I'm working on a Linux server right now, the Apache web server is going to look at that and it's going to say, hey, we're going to go by extensions. I know Linux uses the actual type of the content. It looks at the top of the document and says, hey, this looks like HTML, we're going to handle it as HTML. But the server does its own thing, and it looks at the extension, at that .htm or .html or .jpeg, and it says, okay, I'm going to handle this, but based on what is my configuration. So that's where you can look, and there's a whole list of, in your server configuration, that has what are those content types. So you can set up your content type to be whatever it is, and you can also set up additional processing for certain file types as well. So that's where like PHP files come on in. Generally, it would be served as a text/HTML file, but it can be overridden as it's processed by something that can provide that own header. That can provide its own header for that. So you tell it to send that to the PHP engine if it's .php. If it's if it's a Ruby or whatever scripting language you're going to use, where does it go? These are additional things that you can set up for your server functionality. So you want to go through your settings and make sure there can be, there's tons of settings that you can go in there depending on exactly which server, but these are the basic types for almost all your servers, almost all your web servers that are really important that I can think of, that I'm going to be dealing with as I go on in through my web series of videos on creating a website. So yeah, it can have directives for additional processing as well, where it can send it to a processing engine. So you've also got things like mods and different sites you can configure. You can add sites, you can add additional processing capability with that processing as well. Like, for example, if you're dealing with PHP, does it process it as a CGI, where it runs an executable? It runs a remote executable. That's the PHP executable, and then it's going to return back the response of that executable to the client? Or are we going to be able to process it internally through an internal handler too? Many of these servers also have the ability to do internal handling of some of their scripts. So it's something to take a look at. I know Microsoft Internet Information Systems, or IIS, it has access to PHP. That's a native access to, I'm sorry, not PHP, to ASP, Active Server Pages. It has native access to Active Server Pages. To run PHP, that requires some additional installation, or at least at the time that I was working with it, it did. Maybe they've added it native lately, but thank you for watching.